I used to skip this part. You know the part I mean. You open the very first page of the New Testament, ready for the story of Jesus, and what hits you is a wall of names. So-and-so was the father of so-and-so, who was the father of so-and-so. Begat, begat, begat. 40 generations of men you've never heard of. It's the page everybody's eyes slide right off. For years, mine did too. I treated it like the legal fine print you scroll past to get to the good stuff. And then one day I actually stopped and read it. Slowly, name by name. And I came away genuinely shaken, because it turns out this boring list is not boring at all. It's a smuggling operation, hidden inside this wall of fathers and sons, in a culture where genealogies were supposed to be a spotless record of pure, respectable, male bloodline. Somebody tucked in 5 women, and 4 of them have stories that would make a soap opera blush. A woman who disguised herself as a prostitute to trap her own father-in-law. An actual prostitute from a city God told Israel to destroy. A foreigner from a people who were legally banned. And a woman whose name the text refuses to even write down. This isn't an accident. Nobody put these women in this list by mistake. Somebody did it on purpose, as the very first thing he wanted you to know about Jesus. And once you understand why, the most skipped page in the Bible becomes one of the most beautiful things ever written. So today, we're going to read the list nobody reads. We'll meet all 5 women, and I'm going to save the strangest one for last. The one whose name was deliberately left out, the one where God carved a permanent accusation right into the family tree of his own son. We'll get to her, but not yet. To feel the shock of what Matthew is doing, you have to understand what a genealogy actually was in that world. Because it was not the dusty afterthought it is to us. In the ancient Jewish world, your genealogy was everything. It was your passport, your resume, your property deed, and your membership card, all in one. It told everyone which tribe you belonged to, whether you had a right to the land, whether you could marry into a certain family, and, if you were a priest, whether you were even allowed to serve. A priest who couldn't prove a clean, documented line of descent was barred from the altar. So these lists weren't trivia. They were about belonging, and underneath that, they were about one word above all others: purity. A genealogy existed to prove you were the real thing, undiluted, properly descended, fit to be counted in. And this wasn't theoretical. When the Jewish exiles came back from Babylon to rebuild, the book of Ezra records a heartbreaking little scene. Certain men who claimed to be priests searched for their family records and couldn't find them. And so they were thrown out of the priesthood as unclean, excluded from the holy work because they couldn't prove their bloodline. That's how high the stakes of a genealogy were. The wrong paperwork or a gap you couldn't account for could cost you your place at the very center of the nation's life. A genealogy was a wall, and the whole point of the wall was to keep the line pure and to keep the unqualified out. And there's one more thing worth noticing before we go in. Matthew opens his entire gospel with a Greek phrase that literally means the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ, the same word that names the very first book of the Bible. He is signaling, breath, that this is a new beginning, a new creation story. And the first thing he does in that new beginning is hand you a list. So the list is not the throat clearing before the real story. The list is the overture. Everything Matthew wants to tell you about Jesus is already playing quietly in these names. And there was a second ironclad rule, just as strict as purity. You traced the line through the men, father to son, father to son. Women were the doorways life passed through, but they did not, as a rule, get written into the official record. Open up almost any genealogy in the Hebrew Bible, and you'll find a long, unbroken chain of fathers and sons, and the mothers are simply assumed, invisible, unnamed. Now hold both of those rules in your mind, purity and men only, because Matthew is about to break them both deliberately on the opening page of his gospel, in front of a Jewish audience who would have felt every break like a slap. He's writing to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So far, so expected. He lays out the line of fathers, the kings, the patriarchs. And then, at 4 specific points, he does something that would have made his first readers stop and blink. He reaches into the line and names a woman, and not one of the famous, respectable matriarchs you'd expect a Jewish writer to be proud of. Not Sarah, not Rebecca, not Leah. He skips every single one of the women you could brag about. And instead, he names 4 that, frankly, you would expect a careful editor to leave out. That's the clue. That's the whole thing. When a writer deliberately breaks his own culture's rules, in public, on page 1, he is not being careless. He is making an argument. He is telling you, before Jesus has even been born in his story, exactly what kind of Messiah this is going to be, by showing you exactly who God was willing to write into the family. So, let's meet them, one at a time, and watch what they all have in common. The first woman shows up almost immediately, and her story is one of the ugliest, most uncomfortable chapters in the entire Bible. Her name is Tamar. Here's what happened, and I'm not going to clean it up because Matthew didn't. Tamar married into the family of Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, one of the founding fathers of the whole nation. She married Judah's oldest son, and he was wicked, the text says, and he died. Now, by the custom of that time, when a man died childless, his brother was supposed to marry the widow and give her a child, so the dead man's name and line wouldn't vanish. It was her one lifeline, her only path to security, to a future, to not being a destitute widow forever. So Judah's second son was supposed to do his duty by her, and he refused. He used her and deliberately denied her a child, and he died too. And now Tamar is trapped. There's one son left, the youngest, and Judah, superstitious, maybe blaming her for his dead sons, sends her back to her father's house with a promise. Wait, and when the boy grows up, he'll marry you. And she waits, and she waits, and the boy grows up. And Judah never sends for her. He just leaves her there, in limbo, a widow with no husband and no future, quietly cheated out of her one chance at life. The system that was supposed to protect her has completely failed her, and the man responsible is Judah. So Tamar does something desperate and shocking. When she hears Judah is traveling nearby, recently widowed himself, she takes off her widow's clothes, covers her face with a veil, and sits at the side of the road like a roadside prostitute. And Judah, her own father-in-law, doesn't recognize her, propositions her, and sleeps with her. She's clever, though. Before he leaves, she demands his personal seal, his cord, and his staff as a pledge of payment, the ancient equivalent of his ID and his credit cards, and then she disappears. 3 months later, word reaches Judah. Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is pregnant. She's played the harlot. And Judah, in a stunning piece of hypocrisy, thunders the verdict. Bring her out and burn her to death. And as they're dragging her out to be executed, Tamar quietly sends Judah his own seal, his cord, and his staff with a message. I am pregnant by the man who owns these. Recognize them? And Judah crumbles. He recognizes his own things. And he says the line that turns the whole story. She is more righteous than I. He's the villain of his own story, and he knows it. She did a scandalous thing, but she did it because a powerful man cheated her of justice, and she was fighting for her life. And here is the part you cannot miss. Tamar gives birth to twin boys, and one of them, named Perez, becomes a direct ancestor of King David, and therefore of Jesus. But don't rush past those twins, because there's a haunting detail at their birth. As Tamar is delivering, one baby puts out his hand first, and the midwife ties a scarlet thread around his wrist to mark the firstborn. And then he pulls his hand back in, and his brother Perez is actually born first instead. A scarlet thread tied at the birth of the line of the Messiah. Hold that scarlet thread in your mind, because you are going to see it again very soon in another woman's story, and it is not a coincidence. And think about whose line this is. Judah, the son of Jacob, through whom the great prophecy ran, the one his father blessed by saying, "The scepter will not depart from Judah," the kingly line, the line the Messiah would come from. That royal, messianic line came within an inch of dying out entirely, and the only reason it survived is a wronged widow at the side of a road, doing a desperate, scandalous thing to force a faithless man to keep his word. The line of kings hung by a thread, and a Gentile woman the system had failed is the one who saved it. The Messiah's family tree runs straight through a desperate widow, a roadside disguise, and a patriarch caught in his own hypocrisy. That's woman number one, and Matthew put her name in ink on purpose on page 1. The second woman doesn't need a disguise. The Bible calls her exactly what she was, with no euphemism, Rahab the prostitute, and her story raises the stakes in a way that should stop you. Rahab lived in Jericho, and you need to understand what Jericho was in the story of Israel. It was the first city of the promised land, the first fortress in the path of conquest, the city God had marked for total destruction as Israel came in. Rahab was not just a woman with a scandalous profession. She was a Canaanite, a member of the very people Israel was commanded to drive out, living inside the very city that was about to be wiped off the map. By every category that mattered to a pure Jewish bloodline, she was the wrong religion, the wrong nation, and the wrong reputation. 3 strikes. She is about as far outside the circle of respectable Israel as a human being could possibly be. And when 2 Israelite spies slip into Jericho to scout it, they end up in Rahab's house. The king's men come looking, and Rahab, this Canaanite prostitute, makes a choice that changes her whole life. She hides the spies under stalks of flax on her roof, and she lies to the king's soldiers to protect them. And then she says something that, coming from a pagan woman in a doomed city, is breathtaking. She tells the spies, "I know your God has given you this land. I've heard what he did at the Red Sea. And then, the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth below." A Canaanite prostitute confesses the God of Israel more clearly than most of Israel ever did. So she strikes a deal. "Spare me and my family when you take the city." And they tell her, "Tie a scarlet cord in your window, gather your family inside, and when the city falls, everyone under that scarlet cord lives." And it happens exactly that way. Jericho's walls collapse, the city is destroyed, and one house, marked by a scarlet thread, stands untouched. Rahab and her family walk out of the rubble alive. And there's that scarlet thread again. Stop and feel the echo. A scarlet thread at the birth of Judah's line. A scarlet cord in Rahab's window. And behind both of them, the night of the Passover, when Israel was told to mark their doorframes with the blood of a lamb, so that death would pass over the house. Over and over in this story, salvation comes to people marked by something red, a scarlet cord, scarlet blood, a red sign that says, "This house is spared." Rahab the Canaanite hung scarlet in her window and lived, and her scarlet rescue points all the way forward to a cross, where blood would once again mark out the people who get to walk out of the rubble alive. Matthew is not just listing names. He is weaving a thread, and the thread is red. But the Bible doesn't stop at she survived. It does something far more scandalous to a purity-obsessed culture. Rahab marries into Israel, and Matthew gives us a detail you might skim right past. Rahab becomes the mother of Boaz. Boaz, the kind, godly landowner, the hero of one of the most beloved stories in the Bible. His mother was the prostitute of Jericho, and Boaz is the great-grandfather of King David. So a Canaanite woman who sold her body in a city under a death sentence becomes a great-great-grandmother in the royal line of the Messiah. And centuries later, the New Testament doesn't whisper about her in shame. It lifts her up twice, once as a hero of faith and once as a model of a faith that acts. The prostitute of Jericho ends up in the Bible's Hall of Fame. Stay with that, because the pattern is building, and it's building toward something. The third woman is, on the surface, the gentlest of the four. There's no prostitution in her story, no seduction. Her name is Ruth, and her book is one of the most loved in all of Scripture. But don't let the sweetness fool you, because there is a scandal buried in Ruth too, and it's a legal one. Ruth was a Moabite. And to understand what that word did to a Jewish reader, you have to know the law. The Moabites were old enemies of Israel, and the law of Moses said something blunt and brutal about them. No Moabite, or descendant of a Moabite, may enter the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation. Written into the law itself was a wall with Moab's name on it. Ruth wasn't just a foreigner. She was a foreigner the law specifically named and shut out. And her life had collapsed. She'd married into an Israelite family that had moved to Moab during a famine. And then the men all died. Her father-in-law, her husband, her brother-in-law. 3 widows left with nothing. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, bitter and broken, decides to go home to Israel and tells her 2 foreign daughters-in-law to stay in Moab, find new husbands, start over. The smart move, the safe move, and one of them does. But Ruth refuses, and she says words so beautiful they've been read at weddings for thousands of years. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. A banned Moabite, binding herself to the God who, on paper, had shut her out. So Ruth follows Naomi back to Israel, dirt poor, a foreign widow with no standing, surviving by following the harvesters and gathering the leftover grain they drop, which was the ancient world's version of feeding yourself on scraps. And there she meets Boaz. Yes, that Boaz, the son of Rahab. So the prostitute's son and the banned Moabite meet in a barley field, which tells you God has been quietly weaving outsiders into this line for generations. Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, a relative with the right and the means to rescue Naomi's family by marrying Ruth. And in a tender, daring scene, Ruth lies down at his feet on the threshing floor and asks him, essentially, to cover her, to redeem her. And he does. He marries the outsider. He pays the price to bring her in. And here's the line that should give you chills. Ruth, the Moabite that the law said, keep out to the 10th generation, has a son named Obed. And Obed is the father of Jesse. And Jesse is the father of David, the greatest king in Israel's history, the man whose throne the Messiah would inherit. His great-grandmother was a woman the law itself had banned. The God who gave the law wrote the exception into his own family, and then he let an entire book of the Bible be named after her. Sit with that. There is a book in the Holy Scriptures named after a foreign woman the rules said didn't belong. And there are 2 more things in Ruth's story you should not miss. The first is what Boaz actually is. He's called a kinsman redeemer, in Hebrew, a goel. That was a specific role in the law, the close relative with both the right and the resources to step in, pay the debt, buy back the lost land. and rescue a member of the family who couldn't rescue themselves. Boaz spends his own money and his own name to redeem a destitute foreign widow and bring her in from the cold. And if that idea sounds familiar, a redeemer who pays the price to buy back people who could never buy themselves back. That's because the whole Bible is building toward one. Ruth's rescue is a small, tender preview of a much larger redemption coming at the end of the line. And the second thing is a detail almost nobody notices. On the day Boaz announces he will marry Ruth, the elders of the town speak a blessing over them, and listen to who they name. May your family be like the family of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Stop and let that land. The town blesses the union of the Moabite outsider by invoking the name of Tamar, the other scandalous outsider woman, generations earlier in the same line. It's as if the Bible itself is connecting the dots for us, tying these women together across the centuries, quietly insisting this is how God has always done it, through her and her and her. Now we come to the fourth woman, and this is the one I told you to wait for, because this is where Matthew does the most haunting thing in the whole list. The first three he names, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth. But when he gets to the fourth, watch his words carefully, because the silence is the message. He writes that David was the father of Solomon, and then he does not write by Bathsheba. He writes by the wife of Uriah. He doesn't use her name. Everybody knows who he means. He means Bathsheba. But Matthew refuses to write Bathsheba. Instead, he calls her the wife of Uriah. And once you understand why, it lands like a stone. Because this is the most shameful episode in the life of David, Israel's greatest king. The story is brutal. One evening, David, who should have been away at war with his army, is instead lounging on his palace roof. And he sees a woman bathing, Bathsheba, and he wants her. And he is the king, so he takes her. There's a power here that we shouldn't soften. He's the most powerful man in the kingdom, summoning a soldier's wife while that soldier is away. Risking his life for David's own throne, she becomes pregnant. And David, to cover it up, tries to trick her husband into coming home from the front. Her husband, Uriah. And here's the gut punch. Uriah, the wronged man, is the noble one. He's so loyal to his fellow soldiers that he refuses to go home and enjoy his own bed while they're sleeping in a field at war. So David's cover-up fails, and so David arranges to have Uriah killed. He sends orders to put Uriah at the front of the fiercest fighting and then pull back so he'll be cut down. And it works. Uriah dies, and David takes the widow as his wife and thinks he's gotten away with it. That's the story behind two little words, the wife of Uriah. And now you see what Matthew is doing. He could have written Bathsheba and let the scandal blur a little. Instead, he deliberately writes the wife of Uriah. And in doing so, he carves the crime permanently into the Messiah's family record. Every time someone reads the genealogy of Jesus, they are forced to remember. Here is where the great King David committed adultery and murder. The line does not launder its own history. It does not quietly edit out the worst thing its most celebrated ancestor ever did. It leaves the wound open, with the victim's name attached forever in the family tree of the Son of God. And notice, Uriah was a Hittite, a foreigner. So even here, the outsider stands taller than the insider. The Gentile soldier keeps his honor while the Israelite king throws his away. Matthew will not let you forget the name of the man who was wronged. He writes the Messiah's pedigree as an honest confession instead of a flattering portrait. Who does that? Who opens the story of their hero by listing the family's worst secrets in permanent ink? Only someone who is about to tell you that this hero came precisely for people with secrets like these. And there's a piece of the aftermath that makes the grace here almost unbearable. David didn't get away with it. A prophet named Nathan walked into the palace, told the king a story about a rich man who stole a poor man's one beloved lamb. And when David's anger flared and he demanded the rich man die, Nathan pointed at him and said 4 words that ended David's denial. "You are the man." And David broke. The song he wrote out of that wreckage, "Have mercy on me, O God, wash me, create in me a clean heart," became one of the most honest prayers of repentance ever written, prayed by broken people for 3,000 years since. The first child of that union died. There was real grief, real consequence, real judgment. And then, and this is the staggering part, Bathsheba and David have another son, and his name is Solomon, the wisest king Israel ever had, the one who built the temple, the house of God himself, the next link in the chain to the Messiah. Out of the single worst chapter in David's life, soaked in adultery and blood and a cover-up, God brings the king who builds his temple and carries the royal line forward. That is not God excusing the sin. The sin is named, judged, and grieved. It is God refusing to let even the worst thing we've ever done have the final word over what he can still build. He does not waste the wreckage. He redeems it. So let's stop and ask the real question, the one that unlocks the whole list. Out of all the women in 1,000 years of Israel's history, why did Matthew choose these 4? Not the matriarchs everyone admired. Not Sarah, the mother of the nation. Not Rebecca, not Leah. These 4, why? Scholars have argued about this for centuries, and honestly, I think the 2 strongest answers are both true at once, and together they're the whole point. The first thread, every one of these 4 women was an outsider, a Gentile. Tamar, almost certainly a Canaanite. Rahab, a Canaanite of Jericho. Ruth, a Moabite. And Bathsheba, married into a Hittite household. 4 foreigners, woven into the bloodline of the most Jewish person who ever lived. And that is a thesis statement. Matthew is telling you on page 1. This Messiah did not come only for the insiders. The nations are already in his blood. The gospel that will, by the end of this gospel, go out to all peoples. It was written into his DNA from the start. The walls were already coming down before he was even born. The second thread, every one of these 4 stories involves scandal, irregularity, the wrong side of the rules, a disguised seduction, a prostitute, a forbidden foreigner who lay at a man's feet in the dark, and adultery soaked in murder. These are not tidy stories. They are messy, human, scandalous, the kind of stories families bury. And Matthew drags every one of them into the light. This is not a story about respectable people earning their place in a holy line. This is not a story about a spotless pedigree God could be proud of. This is not a story about keeping the bloodline pure. It is the exact opposite. It is the story of a God who deliberately ran his rescue plan straight through the scandalous, the foreign, the cheated, the broken, and the wronged, and then refused to hide it. And once you see both threads, you realize Matthew has been setting a trap this whole time. 4 scandalous outsider women named on purpose, breaking every genealogy rule in the book. He's been preparing the page for a 5th. And before we meet the 5th woman, I have to stop and correct something, because it would be easy to walk away from this thinking the genealogy is a list of scandalous women. It is not. It is a list of scandalous everyone. The women are just the one Matthew dared to name out loud, but the men in this line are no better. If anything, they're worse. Look at who the women are standing next to. Judah, who we already met, the man who cheated Tamar, slept with a woman he thought was a prostitute, and then tried to have his own daughter-in-law burned alive for the very thing he'd done. He's in the line. David, the adulterer and murderer we just talked about. He's in the line, and he's the high point of it, the great king. His son Solomon, for all his wisdom, ended his life with a harem of hundreds and altars to foreign gods all over Jerusalem. In the line. And keep reading down the list of kings, and you hit a name most people don't even recognize: Manasseh. Manasseh was one of the most evil kings in Israel's entire history. He filled Jerusalem with innocent blood from one end to the other. He set up idols inside God's own temple. And the Bible says he sacrificed his own son in the fire to a pagan god. That man, a king who burned his own child, is sitting right there in the family tree of Jesus, between two of the other fathers. No asterisk, no apology. Go all the way back to the top, and it's the same story. Abraham, the father of them all, twice lied and handed his own wife to another man to save his own skin. Jacob was a deceiver who stole his brother's blessing. This is not a hall of saints. This is a parade of liars, cowards, schemers, adulterers, and at least one man who murdered his own child. 40-some generations. And the honest truth is that the whole list is broken people from top to bottom. So, the women were never being singled out for shame. They were being singled out as the loudest possible proof of the one thing this entire genealogy exists to say. Because in a list where literally everybody needed grace, every king, every patriarch, every father, Matthew chose to make the grace visible by naming the very people his culture would have used to argue that grace has limits: a prostitute, a foreigner, a seductress, a wronged and unnamed woman. As if to say, if there's room in this line for them, then look again at the men and understand. There was only ever room in this line for people who needed mercy. Which is everyone, which is you. Because there is a fifth woman. And after everything we've just walked through, her place at the end of this list changes completely. Her name is Mary, and the way Matthew introduces her is careful and quiet. But if you've been paying attention to the first four, you can feel what he's doing. He writes that Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. And then, the very next thing he tells us is the situation Mary was in. She was pledged to be married to Joseph, and before they came together, she was found to be pregnant. Now read that through the eyes of the village. A teenage girl, unmarried, pregnant. To the neighbors in Nazareth, to the gossips at the well, there was only one obvious explanation, and it was a scandal. Joseph himself, the text tells us, assumed the worst at first. He was a good man, and he didn't want to disgrace her publicly, so he decided to divorce her quietly. The mother of the Messiah began her story under exactly the kind of cloud that would have gotten her whispered about for the rest of her life. Another woman in this line with a story the world would side-eye. And that is precisely why the first four women are there. Do you see it now? For four women, Matthew has been quietly teaching you how God works. He writes his story through women the world would whisper about. He builds his rescue through the scandalized, the foreign, the irregular, the ones with complicated pasts and impossible situations, so that when you finally reach Mary, a young woman in a situation that looked from the outside like one more scandal, you don't recoil. You recognize the pattern, of course. This is exactly how he's always done it. The four notorious women aren't an embarrassment Matthew tolerated. They're the witnesses he called to the stand to testify, before Mary ever appears, that God specializes in writing his greatest works through the people everyone else would have crossed off the list. And there's a beautiful reversal hidden in the comparison. The four women before Mary were each, in some way, caught in a real scandal, a genuine seduction, a genuine profession, a forbidden marriage, and adultery. Mary was caught in an apparent one. To the village, she looked like the next name in the pattern. In reality, she was the purest of them all, a girl who had done nothing but say yes to God. So the line that began with real scandals ends with a scandal that wasn't, as if God spent 4 generations teaching the world to stop trusting its gossip right before he asked it to believe the most unbelievable thing of all. The same neighbors who would have clucked their tongues at Tamar and Rahab and Bathsheba were now clucking them at the Mother of God himself and getting it exactly as wrong as their ancestors had. Tamar fought a powerful man's injustice. Rahab walked out of a doomed city. Ruth crossed a border the law had sealed. Bathsheba was wronged by a king and never even got her name written down. And Mary carried God himself under a cloud of suspicion in a backwater town. 5 women, 4 scandals, and a miracle that looked like a 5th, and every single one of them on purpose in the family tree of Jesus. The bridge, the chapter. You'd leave out. Let me bring this all the way home, because this ancient list is holding up a mirror, and I don't want you to miss your own reflection in it. Every one of us has a family tree with a chapter we'd rather not read aloud, a relative nobody talks about, a season of our own life we've quietly edited out of the official version we tell people. We are all, deep down, curating a cleaner story than the true one. We've all got a wife of Uriah, a name, a year, a thing we did, or a thing done to us that we keep out of the record because we're afraid that if people saw it, we'd be disqualified. Crossed off, left out of the good list. And here is what this genealogy is screaming at anyone willing to actually read it. God does not launder his lineage. He did not pick the respectable, the pure, the people with nothing to hide. He reached straight into the scandals, the seduction, the prostitution, the forbidden marriage, the adultery, the murder, the unwed pregnancy, and he didn't just tolerate those people. He built the bloodline of the Messiah out of them, and then he wrote names down so you would never forget it. The mess wasn't an obstacle God had to work around. The mess was the raw material he chose to work with, which means the thing you're most afraid would disqualify you might be the very thing that proves you belong. Because the Jesus at the end of this list didn't come from a perfect family for perfect people. He came deliberately through the broken for the broken. He came from the kind of people he came to save. And I think we feel the pull of the other way of living so strongly precisely because the whole world runs on the opposite system. The world keeps a ledger. It traces clean lines. It decides who's respectable and who's a cautionary tale, who gets invited and who gets quietly left off the list. And it teaches you to do the same thing to yourself, to build a highlight reel and bury the rest, to introduce the version of you that photographs well and hide the chapter that doesn't. We are exhausted from the curating. We are so tired of pretending to be the clean version. And then you read a genealogy that does the unthinkable. It puts the buried chapters in the headline. It names the prostitute and the foreigner, and refuses to name the king's crime only so that it can point at the victim instead. It tells the truth about the family. And somehow, instead of disgracing the line, the honesty becomes the glory of it. That is a different way to be alive. Not the exhausting performance of the clean story, but the strange relief of being a known, named, fully seen mess who got written in anyway. Outro, 3 takeaways plus open question, 3 shem. So let me leave you with 3 things to carry out of this. First, the list nobody reads is the first sermon of the New Testament. Before Jesus speaks a word, before he heals anyone, before he dies or rises, Matthew preaches the whole gospel in a genealogy. And the message of that sermon is this: Grace was baked into the bloodline from the very beginning. The doors were open to the outsider, the scandal, and the foreigner before the Messiah was even born. If you've been told the Holy Line was about keeping certain people out, read page 1 again. It was about who God kept writing in. Second, and this is the warning, gently, be very careful about who you decide is too far gone for God to use, because every instinct in us wants to do what that culture did. Trace a clean line, keep the respectable in and the scandalous out. Build a tidy story and leave the messy people off it. And every time we do that, we are reading the genealogy backwards. The people you'd be tempted to cross off the list are exactly the people God keeps writing onto it, including, maybe, the person you've crossed yourself off for being. And third, the one I can't stop thinking about. There is a woman in the family tree of the Son of God whose name was deliberately left out, replaced with the title, the wife of Uriah, a permanent reminder of the worst thing that ever happened in that family. God could have edited it. He left it in, and I think he left it in for you. Because if the bloodline of the Messiah can carry an unedited wound with the victim's name still attached and still arrive at Jesus, then your story, the chapter you'd leave out, the name you can't say out loud, does not put you outside of grace. It might be exactly where grace decides to write you in. He is not ashamed to be related to people like the ones on this list, and he is not ashamed of you. So here's what I'll leave you sitting with tonight. Of the 5 women, the one who fought for justice, the one who walked out of the rubble, the one who crossed the forbidden border, the one who was wronged and unnamed, and the one who carried him under a cloud of suspicion, which story is closest to yours? Be honest about it, because the whole point of writing them into the line was so that someone exactly like you would read it one day and finally believe there's room in the story for them too. That's the list nobody reads. And now you know why it's the one you should read first.